Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Momentum Boost. I'm your host, Adrienne Gold Davis, and I certainly hope you had a wonderful, restful Passover. And it's a Monday. It's a new day, and it's a new time for the boost. Starting tonight, we're going to be hosting our weekly boosts on Mondays because that's what you said worked better for you. And I'm really grateful that you joined us tonight. So, first, let's frame this. Yom HaShoah, or in English, Holocaust Remembrance Day, falls on the 27th day of the month of Nisan, which is generally April or May on the Gregorian calendar. So, if that date happens to fall on Shabbat, it's shifted by a day. Now, the date was chosen because it happens to be the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And at 10 o'clock in the morning in Israel, air raid sirens blast through the sound of the air. People stop whatever they're doing. They stop their cars if they're driving. They stand up on the highway. They pay homage, respect, and commemoration to the 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. All of the entertainment venues are closed, and the flags, well, they all fly at half mast. It's a time of profound sorrow and introspection. Now, did you know that the English word Holocaust comes from a Greek word that means sacrifice by fire? Shoah is the Hebrew word for catastrophe or whirlwind, and some people translate it as utter destruction. But mere words do the experience absolutely no justice. In fact, for all of the ink that's been spilled, all the testimony given, all the film that's produced, and the tears that have flowed, we are never going to be able to truly understand or articulate the magnitude of that catastrophe, a catastrophe that is seared into the consciousness of every single Jew. You know, when I was growing up, most of my friends' parents were survivors. Those ubiquitous tattoos that were inked on their forearms of their fathers, their hardworking fathers and their mothers. It made it impossible to forget or even assimilate the horror. And I have one friend whose father woke every single night screaming in terror, and another friend's mother. She showed marked mental imbalance, and all of we kids knew why. For some of my friends, their parents' suffering was like a silent wall. It was this impenetrable fortress that manifested in many, many ways, like overprotectiveness, overfeeding, obsession with cleanliness, ceaseless worry. And for some, there was this bitter anger that just never quite abated. For others, there was this perpetual cheer, the refusal to treat any pain as valid. After all, how could the struggles of a child who had a bed and 3 meals a day carry any weight? And many of my friends learned quickly to bury their personal struggles from their parents who they know and knew even at 6 years old. Their parents were not equipped to cope with it. One of my closest friends said that her inner world was regulated by what she called the Auschwitz-o-meter, if you can imagine. What was that? Well, it meant like this. If you were outside and it was raining and you had to walk home from school, you would say to yourself something like, well, it's not the death march. I mean, at least I have shoes. Or if you didn't like your dinner, you might say, well, at least I have food. Or if you didn't like your new back to school clothes, you might say, well, at least they're not lice-infected striped uniforms. Now, for this friend, well, she never really learned to sit with her negative feelings of any sort. It caused real problems because, you know, when your parents were in Auschwitz, what right did she think she had? And yet, still there were a precious few that I knew whose grit and fortitude brought them to this unimaginably high and lofty place. There were people who had been through the fire and they seemed as though they were refined by it. There were people who chose life and all its blessings and focused on their blessings. And there were people who came back from the dead and started brand new families, new businesses, people who maintained their faith and celebrated it. Now, so for those of us who loved Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, we discovered that based on his psychological hypotheses, something he called logotherapy, and by the way, logo means Greek, in Greek means meaning, so meaning therapy. He said that those who could find purpose and meaning even within suffering seemed to have a better chance of survival. And the late Stephen Hawking once said, However bad life may seem, there's always something you can do and succeed at. Where there's life, there's hope. And Nietzsche most famously said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But when I think about the Shoah, I think about those Nazi guards who understood this principle and perverted it and inverted it intentionally as a way of demoralizing and demeaning us. There were stories I remember reading about people being forced to shovel huge fields of snow, only to be told to put all the snow back where it was at the other end of the field and then do it again. There were prisoners forced to carry heavy boulders across a field and then carry them back again. Purposeless work. And the Talmud tells us that in Egypt, just in the time of Passover that we've just finished, the slaves would be forced to build those storehouses on a kind of quicksand, a sinking sand, so that whenever the structures that they erected today, they were gone tomorrow. And think about the mythological Sisyphus, like, who was punished in the underworld by that Greek god Zeus. Zeus makes him roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. And every time he gets near the top of the hill, that boulder rolls right back down. So how do we commemorate the experiences that the world's greatest philosophers have contemplated, that ancient Greeks mythologized? How do you properly elevate the souls of those who went into the fire and never returned? How do we remember and elevate those lost generations, that tree whose roots were dug out? Well, first of all, it's well understood that none of us have the right, that capacity, the chutzpah, to have an opinion one way or another about how one can or should process that kind of devastation if you went through it. All responses to the Shoah in those who experienced it are equally valid. Whatever one needed to do to put one foot in front of the other and continue to live, well, Dayenu, it would have to be enough. When we see suffering, we're not supposed to, as Jews, offer philosophical words of wisdom and philosophy. Not when a person is in their moment of distress. We are meant to bear witness to it, to give empathy, but not sympathy, to give a hand up, not some rationalization or philosophy, because there are no words of philosophy that replace the act of being a witness. No film, no Schindler's List can capture the horrors. There is no definitive or satisfying answers to that most frequently asked question: where was God during the Holocaust? There is only the hand that you give that raises up. There is only the crying together. There is only bearing witness. And tonight you're going to learn one such act of witnessing, and God willing, incorporate it in your life. Zikaron BaSalon is an initiative that makes what might be, God forbid, seen as ancient history into the seminal and singular experience it is and was. And to explain this and to understand what Zikaron BaSalon is and means, I had a conversation with my dear friend and colleague, Dana Sendermula, who is the director of Momentum's Israel office. Please take a look. Hello, Dana. I'm so thrilled you're with us today. The first thing I need you to do is define the words Zikaron BaSalon, what they mean, what the purpose was of this initiative as well, please.
Of course. Hi, Adrienne, and hi, everyone that's watching us. Zikaron BaSalon literally means memory in the living room. And it is really bringing a memory of our people, a memory of who we are as a people into our intimate space, into our lives, into our salon. And over 10 years ago, when some friends and I initiated and brought forth this project to the world, we really wanted to take something that was on a very much on a national level, meaning there were ceremonies happening in Israel in every school, every army unit, everywhere in the country, there were ceremonies taking place. But for those of us who are no longer students, whether if it's in school or university or a member of now serving in the IDF, everywhere else, the only way to experience the memory of the Holocaust was to watch TV at the end of the day. And we said, young people, we don't want to sit passively anymore and watch Schindler's List again, as much as this is an incredible movie. And we don't want to sit at home and watch these ceremonies, just like thousands of Holocaust survivors did, sitting at home every evening on this one day a year and watch a ceremony taking place. So we said to ourselves, there's an opportunity to take this memory that is still alive. The survivors are still with us. How do we take this memory and bring it into our lives to talk about the past in the present and to make sure that we're incorporating a conversation about the future with these people who are still with us? And I have to say that now when the Holocaust survivors are slowly leaving this world, they're leaving a legacy because thousands upon thousands of them sat in houses and told their story. Those of them who thought maybe I don't have a good enough story, we always tell them we don't audition Holocaust survivors. Each of you have a story to tell and we want to hear it. You no longer have to sit alone in your home on this day, but there are people who want to hear your story. And your story is your family's story, your village's story. We want to hear your story. And so that's one piece of it. And second piece is now that we're seeing how a decade afterwards, we've given all these people the opportunity to tell their story and they're slowly leaving us, leaving the world. And now we're really thinking, how can we take these stories and keep them alive through second and third generations, and also through people who can tell the story through a different angle and bring the story of what happened to us as a people to our living rooms to have a meaningful conversation about it.
Wow. I can see why that would certainly keep the memory component of it alive. And I can see why, as you just said, as the survivors get much older, this will become even more important. But why in our living rooms as opposed to community events? What's the benefit of the intimacy of doing it in your own home?
When we initiated the project, and we find every year more so, that when it's in your living room, when it's amongst friends and family, or even sometimes you just invite your neighbors, you sometimes don't know them. But in this intimate setting, you're not watching this, listening to this taking place, but you're a part of the conversation. And being a part of the conversation is not just hearing a story, but is really thinking about how is it relevant to our lives now? And when we sit in Israel, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when things were, happening in Syria in the most horrible way, just kilometers from us, you're thinking about what's happening today in the world, and how do I, as a Jew, that this most horrible thing happened to us as a people, how do we want to be in the world? So looking at things happening in Africa and things happening to many other people around the world, not that I'm comparing the Holocaust to anything else, but really to think about us as Jews. And while something horrible happened to us, our essence of tikkun olam, repairing the world, this is our role in the world. And what can we learn from the Holocaust is the type of people that we want to be. So when we gather together, we don't only linger about the past, because it's really important to hear the stories, to listen to what happened, to learn from what happened, but also to talk about how do we as a people take action now, today, in Israeli society, in the Jewish world, and also outside of it.
Okay, so essentially, are you telling me that this doesn't just happen in Israel? How could we get involved outside of Israel if we wanted to be part of this initiative?
Amazing. I'm so happy you asked. So Zikaron BaSalon, just in recent years, and also this past year happening on Zoom, but just in the last year, over 1.5 million Israelis took part in Zikaron BaSalon. But I think very importantly to say that Zikaron BaSalon took place in many, many thousands of homes outside of Israel in 57 countries. One of them, of course, was the United States, another Canada, and so many others that I hope are watching today. And so easily, any of you, anyone can go on the Zikaron BaSalon website, and I'm happy to post it in the chat soon. Zikaron BaSalon offers a lot of content in English, in Russian, in Spanish, in many other languages, and we have so many people around the globe, Israelis, Jews, and even non-Jews, taking part in Zikaron BaSalon. Every year we have groups upon groups of grandchildren of Nazis sitting in Germany with Jews and conducting Zikaron BaSalon, talking about their grandparents so many decades ago and having a very tough conversation about the past and the future. But in many other places around the world, we see different people taking what happened to the Jews and taking the Holocaust and also using the methodology of Zikaron BaSalon, of the conversation in the living room, and implementing it in their own stories. They may not be the Holocaust, but every people have their story.
Wow. So essentially, you're creating parlor meetings around issues to ensure that we are all witnesses, even when the original witnesses are no longer with us. And one last question. Would this be, or could it be created in a way that is significant and digestible for children?
100%. Thanks for asking. So Zikaron BaSalon is really for every age, and everyone can do Zikaron BaSalon. Anyone can bring the memory into their living room. You don't have to be a very talented facilitator, and you don't have to be a Holocaust survivor yourself, and you don't have to be someone who works for a Jewish museum for the Holocaust survivors. No, anyone can go on the website, look at the different things that we're offering. There are so many also amazing testimonies that are recorded that can be used, and very explicit questions of what can be asked and what type of discussion can be done at home. And among those are also discussion points for children of different ages. So there are many possibilities.
Thank you so much for describing and explaining it so articulately, and also especially for being part of creating it. Thank you, Donna. It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Whoa. Thank you, Donna. That was enlightening. And it was a great overview of Zikaron BaSalon. I'm going to do it in my own home. God willing, they'll be able to have people in it next year. So tonight, what we're doing is we're conducting our own Zikaron BaSalon event, and we're inviting you to sign up for it. Zikaronbasalon.org. We'll put it in the chat. And you can become a Yom HaShoah activist as well. It's the least we can do. Now, for our first segment, because these evenings are broken down in 3 different steps, we turn our attention to those who survived the unthinkable and have found the strength and the courage to share what they experienced. You're going to join me now in listening to one woman's testimony. Her name is Miriam Ziegler. Remember her name. Listen to her words. Open your heart and imagine her story with your entire being.
This is the gate of Auschwitz when you come in. It says Arbeit macht dich frei in German, which means work makes you free. We came after trains where there was no food, no washrooms, just packed in like sardines. I couldn't understand it. My parents kept me near them, comfortable as much as they could. And then they took us off the trains and they separated the men from the women and they shaved us. And then they gave me, they hurt me with a number, tattooing a number. I didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was.
The idea that there is such a thing as a gas chamber would never occur to anybody. Even today, people don't believe it. We had to undress, and we were under showers, cold showers, lasted maybe 30 seconds. And then we were tattooed. I still have a number, tattooed number.
They took us into the shower, my mother, my aunt, and me. And by that time, my mother knew already, and my aunt, that usually when they take you to the shower, they gas you, like they take you to the gas chambers. But this time they opened the door, and they let us out, and they separated me from my mother and my aunt, and they took me to Birkenau.
In Birkenau, then they put us into the barracks, and of course they did it very quickly. You have to go first, and if you didn't, it would be somebody with a dog or with a leash, and they would beat you. But we still didn't know what was the gas chambers. I thought these were bakeries because to supply, the huge chimneys and a lot of smoke coming out. There was a fellow that I knew from Terezin, and we were walking, and he asked me, "What are those chimneys there?" I said, "That's where they burn the people that they kill." He said, "I can't believe it." He couldn't believe it.
They put me into a barrack with children, and thank God I recognized a couple of boys, and they were a little bit older, and they explained me, they helped me a little bit, advised me what to do and what not to do. And I think I was just plain lucky. Whenever they made roll calls, thank God they didn't take me out. And the few times that they did take me out, thank God I came back. Because most of the children, when they took them out for the experiments, they never brought them back.
The death marches, you just went on and on and on, terrible weather. And my brother fell. He was after illness. And my father stayed back to try to get him up to keep going. And the assessors said, get going. And they could not, so they both shot dead. My mother was too weak, so she was not. So she went to the gas chamber.
Well, I was 4 years old when the war started. I didn't go to school at all. I never played with any children. I was mostly with adults, or working or being hidden.
I don't know about you. Miriam looks like my grandmother. She looks like so many women I see in the nail salon, in the stores. You just don't know people's stories. Okay, now we're moving into the second segment of our Zikaron BaSalon event. Joining us now is a storyteller. She's actually an artist. She uses her art, her fine and beautiful art, to share the story of the people, the experiences, and the community that shaped her Jewish identity. Jacqueline Cotwell's family arrived in Canada in 1949 after the Holocaust. So she's a member of that second generation. Her oil paintings, they reflect on how her family faced the enormous task of starting over, of rebuilding their lives and flourishing after surviving one of modern history's indeed all of history's darkest chapters. So Jacqueline's paintings now, they hang in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. They hang in the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City and in private collections around the world. And she is also a Momentum sister. She went in 2014. She's from Toronto, but she lives in Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Jacqueline Cotwall.
Thank you, Adrienne. I'm gonna share my screen just a second here. And I'm gonna take you right into my presentation. Okay, so just to be clear, I actually spoke for the Museum of Jewish Heritage. I'm going to be speaking for them in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. I hope to show my paintings there at some point in the future when the pandemic is over. So now I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and take you on a little bit of a journey with me. It is truly an honor to be speaking here tonight to commemorate Yom HaShoah together with you and the Momentum community. I went on a Momentum trip in 2014 and its impact on me was profound. When I returned to Chicago, my trip leader, Ali Began, asked me this question: Jackie, why don't you paint Judaic art? At first I resisted the thought. What would I even paint? I'm not a Judaic artist. I paint figures in bathing suits. I like to draw inspiration from vintage family photos taken by pools and at the beach and then turn them into paintings. Judaism and art were two places where I felt very connected, but these were separate loves. Nevertheless, I kept thinking about Ali's question. 5 years later, I launched an exhibit entitled Growing Up Jewish: Art and Storytelling. Based on 5 generations worth of vintage family photos, I was able to create 35 oil paintings and short narratives to tell my family's Jewish story. As you can see here, the Growing Up Jewish project includes joyful moments like summer spent at Jewish overnight camp, trips to Israel, bat mitzvah, and holiday celebrations. But much like the famous verse from the Fiddler on the Roof song, Sunrise, Sunset, Jewish life is laden with happiness and tears. So tonight I'm going to share a sample of paintings from the Growing Up Jewish series that pertain specifically to the Holocaust and its aftermath on my family. Let me take you into slide number 2. Okay. So I want to give you some context. I am a member of the second generation, the 2G. Both of my parents and their siblings, my grandparents, and a fair amount of my extended family lived through the horror of the Holocaust. My father hid in a forest for 19 months. He was with his family, and it was a terrible ordeal during which time my great-grandmother froze to death. It's a tiny detail, but my dad recounted in his memoir that she was wearing a red and white polka-dotted dress. My mother's family was in the Krakow ghetto, narrowly escaping certain death and Nazi firing squads by using false passports to survive. My mother's extended family was interned at Auschwitz, and some of them were saved by Oskar Schindler. All of my great-grandparents perished at the hands of the Nazis. For me, the generation that survived the Holocaust existed in living color, in their printed sundresses, socks, and sandals, with numbers tattooed on their arms. I grew up amongst people who were broken and haunted by their past, but who still managed to summon great love for my generation and indescribable gratitude for Canada, where they emigrated, and the triumph that my sisters, cousins, and I represented. These people were characters with huge personalities. Some were gentle and optimistic, some were hilarious, some were strong-willed, while others appeared to always live at the edge of anger or close to tears. All of them were permanently scarred to varying degrees by living in towns and cities where their neighbors and government turned their backs on them, betrayed them, persecuted, and murdered their parents, friends, and community, all for the crime of being born Jewish. Okay, so there's a slideshow. Okay. So when I created this series, my interest was to look at Jewish identity as it evolved in North America. Truth be told, I deliberately tried to avoid the Holocaust when I started making these paintings. I wanted this series to be completely relatable, no matter where you came from in the arc of the North American Jewish story. But every time I worked on a new image, whether it was my sister Caroline singing the 4 questions at Passover, or my parents' first trip to Israel, or my daughter's bat mitzvah celebration, my mind kept drifting back to the miracle of it all. None of us should be here. Hitler and the Nazis wanted my family and all of our future generations to be gone from the face of the earth. My Auntie Sylvia always used to say, "We are survivors." I never understood why she included me in that statement until now. As I created this painting series, I realized that my art provided a powerful vehicle to honor the memory of my family members who were murdered and whose lives were never spoken of again, and to tell their survival and rebuilding stories of my parents, grandparents, and extended family members. For example, nobody really knew or remembered Usher's story of how he survived a bicycle chain beating while protecting his brother. I only remember him as the quiet, broken uncle who came alone to all of our birthday parties. As a member of the second generation, we are truly a unique subset of the Jewish community. We were used to living in homes where there were no old family photos. We straddled 2 worlds. We were equally comfortable in the homes of Greeners, where broken English was spoken in thick accents and expectations were high. Sometimes these homes felt really heavy and sad, especially if the survivors had whole lives before the war, including spouses and children who were taken from them. In Canada, these families were on round 2, starting over with replacement spouses and replacement children who felt the enormous burden of trying to make highly traumatized parents feel whole again. People who weren't necessarily compatible because of age differences, former social standing in the old country, or religious observance levels, married out of practical necessity or pure loneliness. We understood that too. It wasn't all dark though. My parents were so in love with each other and they appreciated how much they had achieved in Canada. Our home felt pretty free and fun, but we were used to seeing numbers tattooed on the soft skin of the arms that hugged us. We were loved beyond measure and knew that in their eyes, we were considered precious walking miracles on earth. There's nothing quite like the victory look a survivor gazes at his or her grandchild. Likewise, we loved visiting the seemingly carefree modern homes of our friends whose parents were born in North America and did things that were inconceivable to us, like going on family ski trips. When we were growing up, ripped jeans were in style, just like now. And I remember my Holocaust survivor relatives were nervous when we wore them. They worried that we had fallen on hard times again. As loved as we were, there were unspoken rules. Those of us who are 2Gs understand that our parents' generation had been through enough, and our job was to make sure that we did not disappoint them. All they wanted from us was Yiddish nachas, pride and joy. Of course, Yiddish nachas meant different things in different households. In some homes, it simply meant that all we had to do was walk in the room. In others, it meant that we should play the violin, go to law school at least, go to shul, keep kosher, marry someone whose parents are Greeners, and don't get divorced, and on and on and on. It was the least we could do. As I reflected on my family, I marveled at them. I knew their stories of survival. It was the years following the Holocaust that really caught my attention. There were so many obstacles to overcome when they immigrated to Canada in 1949. How did these people arrive in North America with nothing, having endured the worst, and then manage to keep going and make a new life? Who was able to pull it off and what motivated them? Who wasn't? And what was the role of optimism in the rebuilding process? Was opportunity shared equally in these families? Who sacrificed so that others could advance? And what resentments did those left behind harbor inside of them? For many relatives like my Zadie, the prime years of their lives happened during the Holocaust. By the time Zadie arrived in Canada, it was clear to him that real opportunity was reserved for younger generations and not himself. He had to accept the fact that his small schmutza business was never going to amount to much. I also wondered, what was it like to reunite with family members who were safe in Canada during the war and who knew nothing of the suffering? Were these happy reunions or were they awkward? Survivor's guilt was rampant all around. Not to mention the fact that families are complicated. I know that in mine, these reunions sparked the kind of anger that generated a lifetime of broigus, which is Yiddish for holding a grudge. It had something to do with my dad having to sweep the floors of our Canadian cousin's dress factory. Imagine the pride my survivor grandparents, who came from a village that looked like Anatevka, felt when my dad graduated from law school. Being snubbed by Canadian cousins really got under their skin. How did the existing Jewish community prepare to help these people whose material and emotional needs were so profound and overwhelming? From what I understood, the Canadian Jews were quite adept at providing for the material needs of the refugees, but socially and emotionally, there was a huge divide. Neither side wanted to talk about the horrors. This was not a generation that was used to talking about their feelings. The survivors created communities of their own, sticking together at local parks on their days off from work in the garment factories, hoping to find landsmen and grateful to be in the company of people who wordlessly understood them. Every success was monumental. What could be better than passing the high school matriculation exams and then getting a degree and attending law school after virtually missing a lifetime of education during the war years and time spent in the DP camps? How victorious was it to host a Pesach Seder and hear the Canadian grandchildren read the 4 questions at a large family gathering? Think about the satisfaction of being able to volunteer and give financial donations back to the community that supported them and gave them outfits to wear from a clothing bank. Can you imagine these people earning enough money to give tzedakah and spend winters in modest apartments in Florida or going on a vacation to the Catskills? Imagine how powerful it was for these people to visit the modern state of Israel, a place that might have saved so many if it had existed only 10 years earlier in the 1930s. That must have been very difficult for that generation to reconcile. You probably noted in this slideshow that there are images of Jewish life as observed by my generation and my children's generation, albeit somewhat different from the Judaism of the old country. Remember what Auntie Sylvia said? We, the second and third generations, are survivors too. I thought it was important to note that despite everything, the Jewish people continue. Am Yisrael Chai. As I painted these paintings and wrote these stories, I truly felt the awesome responsibility to make sure that my family's Holocaust stories, the ones that were so close to being relegated to the dustbins of history, were uncovered, recorded, and told. I am so grateful to my dad for writing his memoir and my mom for recounting these Holocaust and Jewish stories for me. So I'm gonna, let's get to the next slide here. I'm just gonna take a couple more minutes to speak to you. And I wanna share these 2 paintings and focus on my great-grandparents. You have Chaya Leah on the right and Godel Mengel on the left. They were not married to each other, rather they were machatonim, in-laws. My 2 great-grandparents' stories were almost lost forever because nobody wanted to talk about them. And I think I understand why. Immediately after they were murdered, Godel and Chaya Leah's surviving family members had to compartmentalize these horrors and go into survival mode in order to get through the war, save their children and each other. If they didn't, my grandparents would have completely fallen apart and then they all would have perished. But even in Canada, I believe my grandparents needed to stay partially in survival mode in order to keep moving forward with their lives. Telling their parents' story would cause them to relive the horror all over again. When my sisters and I were born, my parents thought it was too scary to share their fates with us. They wanted to protect us, so we didn't have nightmares. In the end, my great-grandparents were treated as if they didn't exist. But I wanted to know who they were and what happened to them. And my mom finally told me. Here's what happened to Chaya Leah. There was a raid on the Krakow ghetto, during which time my mother, who was only 5 at the time, was hidden with righteous Gentiles. After the raid was over, my mom was returned to her family, and she recalls that everyone was crying and sitting Shiva for her grandmother, Chaya Leah, who was taken during that raid and shot in the street. Chaya Leah tried to move to New York in the 1920s, but it didn't work out. So she stayed in Poland with her 5 children and met her terrible fate. 4 of her 5 children did survive. The little girl on her lap, my Aunt Scylla, was saved by Oskar Schindler. As for my great-grandfather, Godel Mengel, I learned that he was taken to one of the camps and was the victim of the Shoah's most sinister of crimes. I heard my mother's words like sound bites. They used him for science experiments, and they injected him with gasoline. Last year, I Googled his name. Imagine my surprise when a photo from a Krakow ghetto identity card uploaded onto my monitor. I used that image to create this painting. When I learned my great-grandparents' stories, I had this powerful need to honor their lives and provide them with some kind of monument in the form of these paintings for two people who have no graves and whose endings were so undignified. You should note that the background pattern in the painting of my great-grandfather is from my dining room wallpaper, the room where Godel's great-great-grandchildren come together every week to celebrate Shabbat and continue living our Jewish heritage. Okay, this is my last painting. To conclude my presentation, I want to show you a painting I started working on at the beginning of the pandemic. This was my quarantine project, and it is lofty with 31 faces to paint in one image. I wanted to paint this one because this is the group that started in Krakow before the war, survived the Holocaust, and then immigrated to Canada to build a new life. The people here are Chaya Leah and Godel Mengel's descendants. The reason I wanted to create this painting now, especially during COVID, was because it enabled me to remind myself that dark times do pass. I see all these people who live through the unthinkable, dressed in their pink and purple dresses, celebrating a good occasion at a simcha, and I remain optimistic that what we are going through now with this pandemic will pass, and we will all come back together again for better days ahead. Adrian, I'm going to invite you to come back and I will conclude the share.
Amen. Jacqueline, I'm so moved. I can barely breathe. And of course, I had to obsessively decide if I could have one of those paintings, which one would I pick through the entire thing. It was almost too emotional to listen to the story without kind of separating my focus a bit. That was exquisite. Thank you. And now we're going to go to our third and the last part of the Zikaron BaSalon event. We're going to welcome Jacqueline to stay on, please. But we're going to bring on some extraordinary women. Sharon Rich, Diane Nagel, and Ilana Carr. We're going to have a meaningful discussion, the bunch of us together, on how to grapple with the weight of these kind of memories and of course, the lingering effects that the Holocaust has on all of our lives today. All of these women are Momentum sisters, and they are the children of Holocaust survivors. So first, Sharon Rich, she's the author of Just One More Day, Tear-Stained Pages, and Through the Eye of Love. Tear-Stained Pages is a daughter's recollection of her father's experience as a hidden child of the Holocaust. And it features in the permanent collection of the Yad Vashem Library in Jerusalem. She's a keynote speaker at the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, California, and she went on her Momentum journey in 2011. Now, Diane Nagel recently relocated to Clearwater, Florida, where she lives with her new husband, Tom, and she's currently writing her father's memoirs, which she hopes to publish in the very near future. Her father was the third of 5 children born in Kielce, Poland. He survived 3 forced labor camps, the Death March to Gross-Rosen, and he was liberated from Buchenwald in April of 1945. And Diane was with us on the Momentum journey in 2017. And last but certainly not least, Ilana Carr is the mother of 2 wonderful children, Eli and Shira. She lives in Toronto, and she is a Jewish communal professional. She's worked in fundraising in the Jewish community for over 30 years. Currently, she's the Regional Development Manager of United Hatzalah of Canada. And Ilana came with me on Momentum in 2016. I want to welcome all of you women to join me right now. I'm just, before I start to ask you questions, I just want to put this out there to the hundreds of women who are listening right now. Were you children, or are you a child or a grandchild of survivors? And if so, do you know where your parents or grandparents were, what camp they were in, what their experiences were, what cities they were from? Use the chat function and just fill it in. Let us know, because you would be surprised how there is 1 degree of separation from one coast of the country to the other. But in the meantime, it's a privilege to have you fantastic women with me, an honor really. And I want to start with a basic question. I want to know about the fallout. What does it mean to be raised with survivor parents? You've heard all kinds of testimony already, but I want to make it personal. I think I'd like to begin with you, Ilana. Tell me what was the up and where was the down, if you can articulate that.
Thank you, Adrian. It's certainly a hard act to follow after Jacqueline's presentation. It was beautiful. I'm both a daughter and granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. My mother was born in the end of the war and came to Canada in 1948. My grandparents are survivors, and they played a very, very big part of my life. Being a daughter / granddaughter of Holocaust survivors really shaped who I am. I think I was raised with a close sense of love and a close family. It shaped who I am as a Jew. It shaped who I am to want to learn more about being Jewish. The survivor mentality was something that I was raised in, was passed down to my mother, passed down to myself and my siblings. Do I think it was always good? Probably not. We were raised with a sense of doom impending, a sense of worry. I was always around Holocaust survivors. My grandparents were Greenies also. My grandmother had a Hadassah function that everybody had a number on their arm. It was nothing that was foreign to me. And I think that being raised in a family where even as an adult, I remember my mother going to a payphone at the airport when we were kids, having to check in to say where we were, because there was always that sense of, where is everybody? Make sure the family's together, make sure everyone's connected, and make sure we're all safe.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because I've heard your stories before when we talked in advance of this, but Sharon, your family seemed to have the complete polar opposite response. Can you share that with us?
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. So my parents instilled in me a very deep sense of gratitude. We were grateful for the smallest things. We didn't take anything for granted. And if we were ever faced with any kind of adversity or challenge, we found light and we found humor. We laughed at everything. And our sense of humor kind of saved any kind of sadness. Those are the positives as far as so positive. My brother tends to compare any unfortunate situation in his life to, well, this is nothing compared to what Dad went through. His wife, a couple of years ago, at only 49 years old, had emergency triple bypass surgery. She should not have made it. It's a miracle that she survived. And he said, again, oh, this is nothing compared to what Dad went through. And also my father lost, my mom died right before my wedding, and she was only 49. So even when she was sick and dying, and then my dad also got sick, died of cancer, even in their illness, they were grateful that they made it to the ages they were. They were grateful for their lives. So I would say that being the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, it shaped my life in that I feel a deep sense of urgency to retell the stories, leave behind a legacy to the future generations, especially my children and their children, so that we'll always honor our heritage. So I feel like it's my responsibility, it's my duty to retell the story.
Wow. So between the two of you, I'm fascinated by the difference in stylistically. I was saying to you earlier, Sharon, my family also do shtick about everything. That's the way we cope with everything. And we're not survivors, but sometimes it's out of place. It's not always appropriate. What about you, Diane? Tell me what was up and what was not so up in your history.
Well, again, thank you for including me in this wonderful and meaningful program. You know, my mom wasn't a survivor, and she had me relatively late. She was 41 as my father was, and I only had one surviving grandparent on my mom's side who passed away when I was 8. So I was very keenly aware of being a little bit different from other people. My dad had a very thick accent, as well as his 2 surviving sisters, their spouses, and the rest of the family and their friends from the DP camps. So I had this sense of being different. That being said, I had a very strong bond with my father, and it was never really stated that I can recall, but family was of the utmost importance. It was just very strongly emphasized. And every milestone, it was, well, I never thought I would, get to see you be born. And I never thought I'd ever get to see you graduate from high school and grad school and get married and have kids and whatnot. So family was very important. And as well was the concept of just resilience, never giving up. All that he went through, you know what, just keep plugging away, keep plugging away. The downside growing up was overprotectiveness. I understand that, having 2 kids of my own. My husband reminds me, give the kids some space, they're good kids, don't harp on them. I try to follow that, but it's a little difficult, especially since, they're in college and I don't see them every day anymore. But the check-in phone calls, let me know that you're okay, let me know when you get there, let me know this, let me know that. But in the big scheme of things, there was never any negativity from my father. He was reluctant to talk really about his experience because I would get emotional. So very lucky in that respect. He was always very positive and very loving.
Wow. So Jacqueline, you shared an entire family in your exquisite imagery, I must say. The experiences of these 3 women, would you say that their experiences within your entire extended family are represented as well? I mean, are these stories familiar stories to you?
Yes and no. I have to tell you, quite honestly, I don't think I really realized that I was a second generation until I started doing this project. Like, I mean, let me reframe that. We always knew the stories, right? But the way I understood being a second generation, it meant that your parents were in Auschwitz. There was certain death that was looming around them. And my parents, my father particularly, always used to say, we were on the outside. We were on the outside. So it wasn't the same for us. And then eventually I actually met someone from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum who said, no, you are a 2G. So I'm only just really kind of waking up to this idea. And like I said, our home felt pretty free. It was more, I knew that my relatives and my family members and my parents, they were different. Like we didn't go skiing. We didn't, like there was just sort of these unspoken ways of being in our house, like that I guess meant we were a second generation. I'm not giving you a good answer, but that's the truth.
No,
I'm only picking up to it truly now.
No, you're giving me an excellent answer. I'm going to invite the audience once again to please put in the chat your own positives and negatives. I mean, obviously the negatives are ubiquitous, right? There's lots of them, but was there any positives, and did the negatives teach you anything? I want to ask you ladies something else. I have a girlfriend who has a specialty psychotherapy practice. She deals with G2s, as you called it. She deals with the children and grandchildren of survivors. And there are some very specific, particular fallout behavioral shtick that they have. So you're nodding, Sharon. I'm going to ask you, is there anything that you do or that you struggle with that is a legacy of this passed on trauma?
Yeah, I don't know if it's just being Jewish, but I have major guilt, major worry. I'm always worrying. One of my a support group I did once told me worrying is borrowing problems from the future, which is exactly what I do. And I have guilt. Like if I'm freezing, like when we had the outdoor eating, this is just an example, when we were going out to eat and I was really cold, I thought, well, at least I'm not walking without clothes on in the death march. Like I just constantly have these visions of what my father and his little brother and my grandparents went through. And it just doesn't go away, those visions. And then I compare it to my children and think, God, they're so lucky, their problems are nothing. And but again, we're diminishing our own misfortunes by comparing. There's just no comparison.
So it's not just your brother, my friend.
Yeah, that's right.
And tell me, Elena, what is your legacy? They say that the trauma is passed down almost genetically, that there is scientific proof of that. What might you say is your souvenir?
Okay, so I think I suffer from anxiety. I know I suffer from anxiety. It's something that's, I believe, is not just being a Jewish woman who's a child of Holocaust survivors, but I think being raised in a certain way, I think anxiety is definitely a part of everything. And not only in a bad way, sometimes it's okay. But I think having that loving support and I think I always feel a real sense of responsibility to make sure, almost in an obsessive way, that my kids marry Jewish, that my community members marry Jewish and stay Jewish. And, my friends would make fun of me. It's like, enough, Elena, like, I'm obsessed with our community learning and growing about being Jewish. So I think that's the good part. The anxiety, I would say, is not the best part.
And Diane, what about you?
I have read extensively about the transmission of trauma through genetics. The good thing is, I don't think that I have much negativity or negative repercussions from my father's experience. Unfortunately, marrying a non-survivor, someone who grew up in the Depression, they had very different viewpoints. My father wanted to give us everything because he was 14, actually, 2 weeks shy of his 14th birthday when the war broke out, and wanted to give us everything he didn't have, and it was a very loving home. And my mother had some issues, and kind of, always butted heads on that. So I think more of my problems was from her. But the flip side of that was it made me more overprotective of my father. Everything I did always had my father in mind. From the time I was 5, oh my goodness, what happens if my father dies? Never my mom, but always about my dad. And, and I went away to school and grad school. And even, the day after I got married and I moved cross country, I was heartbroken. I was hysterical because I felt so guilty moving away from my father, that he had a family, he had this life, and I was abandoning him. So still, kind of going through that. But then just taking the whole part in family, and he never said anything. He never criticized me for it. Never said a word about it. Just, that's what you do. That's about family. So.
Wow. Okay. I'm going to make one last question. I'm going to give it to one of you, and I'm going to ask our audience to also answer. How do you plan to ensure that the next generations never forget? We cannot plan or micromanage everything that we have anxiety about. I know that it's important to all of us that we help our children live and contain the legacy. Just remember something, and this is something Momentum teaches. In the end, all you can do is be the change you want to see in the world, be the example. Your own passion and your own pleasure and enthusiasm and joy in being a Jew, in the end, that's up to you. So let me just pick one of you. Eeny, meeny, miny. Okay, it landed on you, Ilana Carr. What are you gonna do?
I think you have to lead by example. I was led by my mother, who was led by my booby. And it was just, it has to be not just Jewish education outside of the home, but in the home. It can't just be about the holidays and about saying you have to marry Jewish. It has to be in the home, and you can only pass it on through the heart and through education, and by, a little bit shoving it down their throats, but in a positive way and in a loving way. And I think there's so much amazing things about Judaism that our kids can learn about, and it doesn't have to be schlepping them to shul. It's just everything we do and showing the good things. And I think it comes from within. It really does. And the Momentum trip was amazing, and it was definitely about that. So send your kids on as many trips as you can to Israel. Birthright, Holocaust education, I'm forgetting, March of the Living. Just have to really keep it in the family. And my kids are lucky because they were able to speak with my booby, who died at 99 a year ago, about the Holocaust. Most kids won't have a chance to be able to go on a March of the Living and meet survivors. So these testimonies and the idea of having this thing in your family and in your living room, I think is amazing. Outside celebrations, I think it's community celebrations and community-wide gatherings, as well as in the home.
Ladies, I don't know how to thank you enough for how articulate and honest and vulnerable and brave you were, and you are a tribute And I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all of you in Momentum Land. Thank you so much for joining us. This Zikaron BaSalon, this remembrance from our living room, has been so moving for me. And we hope you'll join us again in the future. And just so you know, the link to their website is going to be put into the chat function, so you can sign up and you can host a live or a virtual event like we did tonight. And let's never forget what we've heard. We have to bear witness. We got to teach our children so that we can remember what happened and prevent it from never happening again.